Elena Martinez clutched the worn photograph in her trembling hands as the train pulled into Millbrook Station. The man in the picture had kind eyes and a gentle smile. Thomas Blackwood, her husband-to-be, whom she'd never met in person. After 3 months of correspondence, she'd traveled from Chicago to this remote Colorado town with nothing but a small suitcase and desperate hope for a new beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What she found waiting for her wasn't a wedding ceremony, but a funeral shroud. The October wind cut through Eleanor's thin coat as she stepped off the train platform, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Millbrook was smaller than she'd imagined, a collection of weathered buildings nestled between towering pines and jagged peaks. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something terrible to happen. Sheriff Daniel Hayes approached her with heavy steps, his badge catching the pale afternoon light. His weathered face carried the weight of bad news, and Elena's heart began to race before he even spoke. "Miss Martinez." His voice was gentle but strained. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news about Thomas Blackwood." Eleanor's grip tightened on her photograph. Is he not coming to meet me?" The sheriff removed his hat, running his fingers through graying hair. "Ma'am, Thomas passed away 3 days ago. Heart attack," the doctor said. "Sudden and unexpected. He was only 32. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She swayed, slightly, feeling as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. The photograph fluttered from her numb fingers, landing in the dirt beside the train tracks. "But we were supposed to be married tomorrow," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "He wrote to me just last week. He seemed so excited, so happy." Sheriff Hayes bent down to retrieve the photograph, brushing off the dust before handing it back to her. "I'm real sorry, miss. Thomas was a good man. Quiet, kept to himself mostly, but decent folk. This whole town's been shaken by his passing." Elena stared at the image of Thomas, trying to reconcile the vibrant man who'd written her such passionate letters with the reality that he was gone. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, more to herself than to the sheriff. "I sold everything I owned to come here. I have nowhere else to go." "Well," Sheriff Hayes said slowly, "there might be one option. Thomas had a twin brother, Marcus, lives up in the old Blackwood cabin about 5 miles outside town. He's different from Thomas. Been living alone up there for years. Barely comes to town except for supplies. But he's family, and the cabin belongs to both of them by rights." Elena looked up sharply. "A twin brother?" Thomas never mentioned having a brother in any of his letters. The sheriff's expression grew uncomfortable. "Like I said, Marcus is different. The brothers had some kind of falling out years ago. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but they hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. Still, with Thomas gone, Marcus is the only family connection you have here." As if summoned by their conversation, a figure emerged from the tree line at the edge of town. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The man walking toward them looked exactly like Thomas. The same angular jaw, the same dark hair, the same tall, lean frame. But where Thomas's photograph showed warmth and openness, this man carried himself with rigid tension, his shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. Marcus Blackwood moved with predatory grace, his eyes scanning the town with suspicious intensity. When his gaze fell upon Elena, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His eyes were the same shade of deep brown as Thomas's, but they held something cold and calculating that made her instinctively step closer to the sheriff. "Hayes," Marcus said, his voice a rough approximation of what Elena remembered from Thomas's. "Single phone call weeks ago. I heard the train come in." "Marcus," the sheriff acknowledged with a slight nod. This is Elena Martinez. She was supposed to marry Thomas tomorrow. Marcus's eyes never left Elena's face as he processed this information. She watched a series of emotions flicker across his features. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been hunger, and finally a carefully constructed mask of sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, though his tone suggested the words were unfamiliar in his mouth. "Thomas spoke of you in his letters." Elena frowned. "He wrote to you? But Sheriff Hayes said you hadn't spoken in years." A shadow passed over Marcus's face. "We corresponded occasionally, business matters mostly, the property, family obligations." He paused, studying her with unnerving intensity. He mentioned he'd found someone special, someone who understood loneliness. There was something in the way he said loneliness that made Elena's skin crawl. She glanced at Sheriff Hayes, hoping for some guidance, but the lawman seemed eager to conclude this uncomfortable encounter. "Well," Hayes said, clearing his throat, "I suppose you two have things to discuss. Miss Martinez, the boarding house is full up, but Mrs. Chen at the general store might have a room above the shop if you need somewhere to stay while you figure in things out." Marcus stepped forward. "That won't be necessary. The cabin has plenty of room, and Elena is practically family. Thomas would have wanted her to stay there." Elena felt trapped between politeness and instinct. Every fiber of her being screamed that something was wrong with Marcus Blackwood, but she had limited options and even less money. "I don't want to impose," she said carefully. "It's no imposition," Marcus replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Thomas invested considerable time and emotion in your correspondence. The least I can do is honor his commitment to your welfare." The way he phrased it made Elena feel like a piece of property being transferred from one owner to another. But the alternative was sleeping in the streets of an unfamiliar town, with winter approaching and no money for a train ticket back to Chicago. "I suppose, just for a few days until I can make other arrangements," she agreed reluctantly. Marcus nodded once, a sharp, satisfied gesture. "I'll get my wagon, your trunk." "Just this suitcase," Eleanor said, lifting her single piece of luggage. Something flickered in Marcus's expression, disappointment perhaps, or calculation. "Travel light, do you? Thomas mentioned you'd lost your family in the influenza outbreak. No ties keeping you in Chicago." Elena hadn't mentioned the influenza in any of her letters to Thomas. A cold knot formed in her stomach. How did he know about that? "People talk," Marcus said vaguely. "Small communities, even big cities. Everyone knows everyone's business eventually." But Elena knew that wasn't true. She'd been careful in her letters to Thomas, sharing her hopes and dreams, but keeping the painful details of her past private. The death of her parents and younger sister had been devastating, but she'd only alluded to family losses, never specified the cause or extent. Marcus returned with a weathered wagon pulled by two dark horses. As they loaded her suitcase, Elena noticed that his hands were different from Thomas's photograph. Where Thomas had appeared to have soft, scholarly hands, Marcus's were scarred and calloused, with dirt permanently embedded under his fingernails. The ride to the cabin passed in uncomfortable silence. Elena tried to make conversation, asking about Thomas's life in Millbrook, his work, his interests. Marcus's answers were vague and sometimes contradictory. He said Thomas had worked at the lumber mill, then corrected himself to say he'd been a clerk at the bank. He mentioned Thomas loved to read, then seemed surprised when Elena asked about his favorite books. "We were different people," Marcus finally said, his tone suggesting the topic was closed. "Brothers don't always share interests." The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their branches creaking ominously in the wind. It was larger than Elena had expected, a two-story structure with a wraparound porch and multiple additions that suggested decades of expansion. But despite its size, the building felt oppressive, as if it were crouching in the shadows of the surrounding forest. Marcus helped Elena down from the wagon, his hands lingering on her waist longer than necessary. "Welcome to your new home," he said, and the possessive way he said "your" made Elena's blood run cold. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly well appointed. Fine furniture, expensive rugs, and shelves lined with leather-bound books created an atmosphere of refined comfort that seemed at odds with Marcus's rough exterior. But there was something sterile about the space, as if it were a stage set rather than a lived-in home. Thomas had good taste, Elena observed, running her fingers along the spine of a poetry collection. Yes, Marcus agreed, watching her closely. He appreciated beautiful things, collected them, you might say. Elena turned to find Marcus staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "I should probably rest," she said quickly. "It's been a long journey, and tomorrow I need to start figuring out my next steps." "Of course," Marcus said smoothly. "Thomas's room is upstairs, first door on the right. I've prepared it for you." The idea of sleeping in her dead fiancé's bed felt macabre, but Elena nodded her thanks. As she climbed the narrow staircase, she heard Marcus moving around in the kitchen, the sounds of meal preparation echoing through the house. Thomas's bedroom was spartanly furnished, but comfortable. Elena set her suitcase on the bed and opened it to retrieve her nightgown. As she lifted the folded garments, a small leather journal fell out, Thomas's last letter to her, which she'd kept close during the journey. She opened it to read his familiar handwriting once more, seeking comfort in his words. But as she read, confusion replaced grief. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The handwriting looked different somehow, more angular and harsh than she remembered, and the content seemed strange. References to her compliance and obedience, words that felt alien to the gentle tone of his earlier correspondence. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her door. Elena quickly closed the journal and tucked it under her pillow, then moved to the window to look out at the darkening forest. Something moved between the trees, a flash of white that could have been a shirt or dress. But when she looked more carefully, she saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Dinner was an uncomfortable affair. Marcus had prepared an elaborate meal of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and fine wine. He seemed to be making an effort to impress her, but his conversation felt rehearsed, as if he were playing a role he'd studied but never fully mastered. Thomas often spoke of his desire for companionship, Marcus said, refilling Eleanor's wine glass. He felt isolated here, cut off from the world. He believed marriage would cure that loneliness. Elena pushed food around her plate, her appetite diminished by grief and unease. He wrote such beautiful letters about building a life together, about love and partnership. I thought I knew him, even though we'd never met. Letters can be deceiving, Marcus observed. People present idealized versions of themselves on paper. The reality is often more complex. "Did you read his letters to me?" Elena asked directly. Marcus paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Occasionally, when he asked for advice about phrasing or sentiment, he wanted to make a good impression, but something in his expression suggested this wasn't entirely true." Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that Marcus knew more about her correspondence with Thomas than he was admitting. After dinner, Marcus showed her around the rest of the cabin. The tour felt performatory, as if he were marking territory rather than being hospitable. He pointed out practical details, the water pump, the root cellar, the workshop behind the house, but Elena noticed he avoided certain areas, particularly a locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway. "What's in there?" she asked, gesturing toward the locked room. "Storage," Marcus said curtly. "Old furniture, papers, nothing interesting." But Eleanor caught the way his hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, where she glimpsed the outline of a key ring. Whatever was behind that door, Marcus was very protective of it. That night, Elena lay in Thomas's bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her. Wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the walls she could hear the scurrying of small animals. But beneath these natural sounds was something else, a rhythmic creaking from somewhere above her room, as if someone were pacing back and forth in the attic. She rose and tiptoed to her door, pressing her ear against the wood. The house seemed quiet, but she could swear she heard the soft murmur of conversation coming from downstairs. Marcus's voice, low and intense, as if he were speaking to someone. But Eleanor hadn't seen any visitors arrive, and she was certain they were alone in the cabin. Curiosity overcame caution. She opened her door and crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear Marcus's words. His voice drifted up from the kitchen, barely audible but unmistakably present. "She's here now," he was saying, "just as we planned. She's perfect, young, alone, no family to ask questions." Thomas's taste was always impeccable, even if his methods were sloppy. Elena's blood turned to ice. Who was Marcus talking to? And what did he mean about Thomas's methods being sloppy? "The resemblance will be enough," Marcus continued. "She'll never know the difference, especially once we begin the conditioning. By spring, she'll be completely compliant, just like the others." Others? Elena gripped the banister, her knuckles white with tension. What others was Marcus referring to? A floorboard groaned under her weight, and Marcus's voice stopped abruptly. Elena held her breath, praying he hadn't heard her. After several long moments, she heard his footsteps moving toward the front door, followed by the sound of the door opening and closing. She waited until she was certain he'd left the house before creeping downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but on the table sat 2 coffee cups, both still warm. Someone had definitely been there with Marcus, someone who had left through another exit when they heard Elena on the stairs. Elena searched the kitchen quickly, looking for any clue about Marcus's mysterious visitor or the conversation she'd overheard. In a drawer near the stove, she found a collection of letters tied with ribbon. Her heart sank as she recognized her own handwriting. These were the letters she'd sent to Thomas over the past 3 months. But as she examined them more closely, she realized something was wrong. Several of the letters had been opened and resealed, the wax seals slightly different from what she remembered. And in the margins of some pages, she found notes written in a handwriting that matched neither Thomas's gentle script nor Marcus's harsh scrawl. Someone else had been reading her private correspondence. Someone who had been analyzing her words, studying her vulnerabilities, learning her secrets. Elena's hands shook as she retied the ribbon and returned the letters to the drawer. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee into the night and never look back. But where could she go? She had no money, no transportation, and no allies in this isolated mountain town. As she crept back upstairs, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would play along with whatever game Marcus was playing, but she would also be watching, learning, gathering information. If he thought she was just another helpless victim, he was about to discover how wrong he could be. The woman who had survived the influenza outbreak that killed her entire family hadn't done so by being weak or naive. She had survived by being smart, resourceful, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. Marcus Blackwood had no idea what he'd invited into his home. Outside her bedroom window, the forest whispered secrets in the wind, and somewhere in the darkness, Elena was certain she could hear the soft sound of footsteps circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. Elena forced herself to remain calm despite the terror coursing through her veins. Years of surviving Chicago's harsh streets had taught her that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, she studied Marcus carefully, searching for weaknesses in his composure. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. I'm not as helpless as you think. Marcus tilted his head, genuinely curious. Oh, and what makes you believe you have any power in this situation? Because I know things about you that you don't realize I know, Elena replied, gambling on her observations from the past 2 days. For instance, I know you've been impersonating Thomas in our correspondence for weeks, possibly months. The handwriting in his final letters was different, more like yours. And I know you have a partner in town, someone who helped you research my background and arrange my arrival. A flicker of surprise crossed Marcus's features before his mask of control returned. Clever girl. Thomas always did prefer intelligent women. It makes the process more interesting. What process? Elena demanded. What did you do to those other women? Marcus rose from his chair and began pacing the small room, his movements predatory and calculated. Those women found their true purpose here, just as you will. Society has such rigid expectations for females. Be demure, be obedient, be decorative. But here, away from judgment and interference, we can strip away those artificial constraints and discover what lies beneath. Elena felt sick. You brainwashed them. Such an ugly word, Marcus said, waving his hand dismissively. I prefer to think of it as refinement, like polishing a rough gemstone until it reveals its hidden brilliance. Each woman who came here was running from something, poverty, scandal, loneliness. I gave them something to run toward instead. And if they refused? Marcus's smile turned cold. No one refuses eventually. The human spirit is remarkably adaptable when properly motivated. Isolation, dependency, the gradual erosion of previous identity. These are powerful tools when used with patience and skill. Elena realized she was looking at a man who had perfected psychological torture into an art form. How long have you been doing this? 23 years come December, Marcus said, with obvious pride. I was quite young when I began. Barely. 18. The first few attempts were crude, admittedly. I learned through trial and error, studying my subjects' responses, refining my techniques. Thomas was initially resistant to my methods, but he came to appreciate the elegance of the system. Elena's mind raced. If Marcus had been doing this for over 2 decades and Thomas had been involved, then the twin brother story was likely another fabrication. Thomas wasn't really your twin, was he? Marcus laughed, clearly delighted by her deduction. Very good. No, Thomas was my first successful project, a traveling salesman who happened upon this cabin during a blizzard in 1882. Handsome fellow, well-educated, charming personality. I was quite lonely in those days, you understand. My father had recently died, leaving me this property and a considerable inheritance, but no companionship. The horrifying truth began to crystallize in Elena's mind. You turned him into your brother. I gave him a new identity, a new purpose, a new family, Marcus corrected. He became everything I needed him to be, my partner in business, my companion. In this isolated place, my assistant in acquiring and training new subjects. For over 20 years, we worked together in perfect harmony, until he tried to stop you, Elena guessed. Marcus's expression darkened. Thomas developed sentimental attachments to our later subjects. He began questioning the necessity of the process, suggesting we release women who had completed their training. It was a fundamental disagreement about the nature of our work. Elena understood now why Thomas's letters had seemed so genuine, despite being written under Marcus's influence. Some part of the original man had survived the conditioning, enough to feel genuine affection for her, and perhaps guilt about luring her into this trap. He was going to warn me, wasn't he? She said. That's why you killed him. Thomas died because he forgot his place in our carefully constructed world, Marcus replied coldly. He began making unauthorized contact with you, deviating from our agreed-upon correspondence strategy. I couldn't allow such unpredictability to jeopardize decades of careful work. A sound from somewhere else in the house interrupted their conversation. Footsteps in the hallway, followed by voices. Marcus's head snapped toward the door, his composure cracking slightly. "Excuse me," he said, moving toward the exit. "We'll continue this fascinating discussion shortly." Elena heard the soft click of a lock engaging as Marcus left the room. Immediately, she began testing her restraints, looking for any weakness in the silk scarves binding her wrists. The fabric was strong, but not impossibly so, and Elena had learned a few tricks during her time surviving on Chicago's streets. While she worked at loosening the bonds, Elena studied her prison more carefully. The morning room was clearly designed for long-term occupation, with a small wash basin in one corner and a chamber pot discreetly hidden behind a decorative screen. The porcelain dolls watching from their shelves seemed to be arranged in specific poses, and Elena realized with growing horror that they might represent previous subjects, commemorative figures created to honor Marcus's victims. The voices in the hallway grew more agitated, and Elena could distinguish Marcus speaking with at least two other people. One voice belonged to Sheriff Hayes, but the other was unfamiliar, a woman with a sharp, authoritative tone that cut through the walls like a blade. "Told you to be more careful about the timing," the woman was saying. "2 disappearances. In 6 months will attract attention, even in a backwater like Millbrook." "The opportunity was too perfect to pass up," Marcus replied defensively. "She fits our requirements exactly, and her background makes her ideal for long-term projects." "Your requirements," the woman corrected sharply. "My requirements are discretion and profitability. This romantic fixation of yours is becoming a liability." Elena's blood chilled as she realized the scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just Marcus acting alone. There was an entire network involved in kidnapping and trafficking women. Sheriff Hayes spoke up, his voice nervous and strained. "Doc Patterson is asking questions about the supposed accident. He wants to examine the body before signing the death certificate." "Then give him a body," the woman snapped. "We have several in cold storage that match the general description. A few days in the river will eliminate any distinctive features." Elena had to bite her lip to keep from crying out in horror. They were discussing desecrating corpses to cover up her kidnapping, treating human remains like props in their elaborate deception. "What about the long-term situation?" Hayes asked. "People in town knew Thomas was expecting a bride. If she just vanishes—" "She didn't vanish," Marcus interrupted. "Elena Martinez died tragically before the wedding could take place. It's a sad story that will be remembered fondly but briefly. Meanwhile, a new woman will gradually appear in my household, perhaps a distant cousin, come to help with my grief, or a housekeeper hired to maintain the property. No one will connect the 2 stories." Elena realized that Marcus had perfected this system over decades of practice. He had created a seamless method for making women disappear from their old lives and emerge as entirely new people under his control. The conversation continued for several more minutes before Eleanor heard footsteps retreating down the hallway. Marcus returned to the morning room, his earlier good humor restored. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, settling back into his chair. "Business matters, you understand. Now, where were we?" "You were explaining how you're going to murder me," Elena said bluntly. Marcus looked genuinely offended. "Murder? My dear girl, I have no intention of killing you. Dead women are of no use to anyone. I'm going to transform you into someone far more valuable than Elena Martinez ever could have been. And what if I refuse to cooperate?" "You'll cooperate," Marcus said with calm certainty. "They always do, eventually. The process begins with isolation, which we've already achieved. Then comes dependency, as you realize that I control every aspect of your survival. Food, water, warmth, human contact, all of these become privileges that must be earned through compliance. Eleanor felt her courage wavering as Marcus described the systematic breakdown of her identity. She had survived terrible circumstances before, but never anything as calculated and methodical as this. The third stage involves replacement, Marcus continued, warming to his subject. As your old identity becomes associated with pain and deprivation, we'll begin constructing a new one associated with comfort and reward. New name, new personality, new memories carefully crafted to replace the old ones. It's remarkable how quickly the human mind adapts when properly motivated. How long does this process take? Elena asked, horrified by her own curiosity. It varies by subject, Marcus replied thoughtfully. The youngest and most traumatized women adapt most quickly, sometimes as little as 3 months. Older, more established personalities require more time and effort. In your case, I estimate 6 to 8 months for complete transformation. Elena struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Marcus was describing. He wasn't just planning to imprison her. He was going to systematically destroy every aspect of her identity and rebuild her as someone else entirely. What happens to the women after they're transformed? She asked. Marcus's eyes gleamed with pride. They become whatever their new circumstances require. Some join households as companions or servants. Others are married to associates who require wives with specific characteristics. A few remain here permanently, helping to train new subjects. Each finds her perfect place in our carefully ordered world. You sell them, Elena said, the full horror of the situation becoming clear. You're running a human trafficking operation. Such crude terminology, Marcus said with distaste. We provide a service to discerning clients who require female companionship, with particular qualities: intelligence, beauty, obedience, discretion. Our subjects receive food, shelter, purpose, and protection. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Elena realized she was dealing with a madman who had convinced himself that slavery was a form of charity. Marcus genuinely believed he was improving these women's lives by destroying their identities and selling them to the highest bidder. The woman in the hallway, Elena said. She's your business partner? Marcus nodded. Dr. Victoria Ashworth, a brilliant woman, trained in the latest psychological and medical techniques. She oversees the more technical aspects of our operation, while I handle recruitment and initial conditioning. Together, we've built something truly remarkable. Elena filed away the name, hoping desperately that she would survive long enough to use the information. And Sheriff Hayes? A necessary ally, Marcus said dismissively. Local law enforcement must be managed carefully in an operation of this scope. Hayes ensures that inconvenient questions aren't asked and problematic investigations are redirected. The casual way Marcus discussed corrupting law enforcement officials made Elena realize the true scope of the conspiracy. This wasn't just an isolated madman acting alone. It was a sophisticated criminal organization with connections throughout the region. A soft chime from somewhere in the house interrupted Marcus's explanation. He checked a pocket watch and smiled. Dinner time, he announced. I'll have something brought to you shortly. Tomorrow we begin your transformation in earnest, so I suggest you use tonight to make peace with Elena Martinez. By Christmas she'll be nothing but a fading memory. Marcus left the room, once again locking the door behind him. Eleanor immediately resumed working on her restraints, desperation lending strength to her efforts. She had to escape before Dr. Ashworth began whatever medical procedures were involved in the transformation process. As she struggled with the silk scarves, Elena's mind raced through possible escape plans. The house was isolated, but she had studied the layout during her brief time of freedom. If she could get to the workshop where Marcus kept his tools, she might find something to use as a weapon. From there, she could try to reach the stone wall and follow it to a road or trail leading back to town. But even if she escaped the immediate area, Elena faced the problem of Sheriff Hayes's corruption. Going to the local law enforcement would likely result in her being returned to Marcus immediately. She needed to find another ally, someone with the authority and motivation to investigate the conspiracy. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her planning. Elena quickly arranged herself to look as if she hadn't been struggling with her bonds, forcing her breathing to return to normal. The door opened to reveal not Marcus, but a young woman carrying a dinner tray. Elena's heart leaped with hope until she saw the girl's vacant, glassy-eyed expression. This was one of Marcus's previous victims, transformed into exactly the kind of compliant servant he had described. "Good evening," the woman said in a soft, mechanical voice. "My name is Sarah. I've brought your dinner." Elena studied Sarah's face, looking for any sign of the person she had been before Marcus destroyed her identity. The woman was perhaps 25, with auburn hair and delicate features that might have been considered beautiful if not for the empty, soulless expression in her eyes. "Sarah," Elena said gently, "how long have you been here?" "I arrived in the spring," Sarah replied without emotion. "Master Marcus has been very kind to me. I'm much happier now than I was before." The robotic quality of Sarah's response sent chills down Elena's spine. This was what awaited her if Marcus's process succeeded: complete obliteration of her personality, replaced by artificial compliance and gratitude toward her captor. But as Sarah set down the dinner tray, Elena noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. The woman's hands were shaking slightly, and when she thought Elena wasn't looking, her blank expression flickered for just a moment, revealing a flash of desperate terror underneath. Some part of the original Sarah was still fighting, still aware, still trapped inside the constructed personality Marcus had built around her. If Elena could find a way to reach that buried consciousness, she might have an ally in her escape attempt. "Sarah," Elena said urgently, "do you remember who you were before you came here?" The woman's face went rigid, and she backed toward the door. "I don't understand the question. I've always been Sarah. Master Marcus saved me from my previous confusion and gave me purpose." But Eleanor had seen the fear in Sarah's eyes, the momentary crack in her programmed responses. Somewhere inside this broken woman was a person desperate to be free, waiting for someone brave enough to help her remember who she used to be. As Sarah hurried from the room, Eleanor made a silent vow. She would escape from this nightmare, and when she did, she would find a way to save Sarah and any other women trapped in Marcus's web of psychological torture. The question was whether she could accomplish this before Dr. Ashworth arrived to begin her own transformation into someone else entirely. Dr. Ashworth's surgical preparations created a flurry of activity throughout the cabin. Eleanor could hear furniture being moved, equipment being assembled, and hushed conversations as the conspirators adapted their plans to the new timeline. Through it all, she remained perfectly still on the bed, feigning resignation while her mind raced through escape scenarios. Marcus paced the morning room like a caged animal, his earlier composure completely shattered. "This is madness, Victoria. We're abandoning 20 years of proven methodology for an untested procedure that could destroy everything we've built." "What we've built is already compromised," Dr. Ashworth replied, without looking up from her instrument case. "Thomas's emotional complications, your own developing attachments, the federal investigation, these are symptoms of systemic failure in your psychological approach. Surgical modification eliminates such variables." Eleanor noticed that Sarah had entered the room carrying clean linens, her movements as mechanically precise as always. But when the transformed woman caught Eleanor's eye, there was a flicker of something desperate in her gaze, a fragment of consciousness trying to communicate. "Sarah," Dr. Ashworth called sharply. "Prepare the surgical suite. Standard sterilization protocols." "Yes, doctor," Sarah replied in her hollow voice. But Elena saw her hands tremble slightly as she arranged the linens. As Sarah worked, Elena caught her attention and mouthed a single word: "Help." The response was immediate. Sarah's blank expression cracked for just an instant, revealing raw terror underneath. Then the mask snapped back into place, but Elena had seen enough to confirm her suspicions. Some part of Sarah's original personality remained trapped inside the conditioning, aware but powerless to act. Dr. Ashworth finished arranging her surgical instruments and turned to Marcus. "I'll need your assistance during the procedure. Your knowledge of the subject's psychological profile will help me target the most effective neural pathways." Marcus looked sick. "I've never participated in surgical modification before. My expertise is in behavioral conditioning, not neurosurgery." "Then consider this education," Dr. Ashworth said coldly. "The future of our operation depends on adapting to more efficient methods. You can evolve with the organization or become obsolete like Thomas." The threat was unmistakable. Marcus's partnership with Dr. Ashworth would continue only as long as he proved useful to her surgical approach. Elena realized that her captor was almost as trapped as she was, bound by fear and financial dependency rather than physical restraints. Sheriff Hayes returned to the room, his anxiety more pronounced than before. "The marshal is asking specific questions about the Blackwood property. Someone gave him detailed information about the mail-order bride advertisements and Thomas's correspondence." Eleanor's heart leaped. The federal investigation wasn't just a general inquiry. Someone had provided specific intelligence about the operation. Perhaps Thomas had left behind evidence of his growing doubts, or maybe one of the previous victims had managed to get word to authorities before being transformed. "How much time do we have?" Dr. Ashworth asked. "He's interviewing people in town today, but he hasn't requested a warrant yet," Hayes replied. "My guess is he'll want to search the property tomorrow or the day after." Dr. Ashworth nodded decisively. "More than enough time. The surgical modification will be complete within 4 hours. Even if federal agents discover Elena's physical presence, they'll find a cooperative witness who remembers nothing of her previous identity or experiences." Elena watched Sarah's reaction to this conversation and saw the woman's mechanical composure waver slightly. Whatever conditioning had been used on Sarah, the mention of federal agents searching the property seemed to penetrate her programmed responses. As the conspirators continued planning, Elena worked carefully at her restraints. The silk scarves were now loose enough for her to slip her hands free, but she needed the right moment to act. Premature escape would only result in tighter security and accelerated surgical intervention. Dr. Ashworth began wheeling a cart of medical equipment into the morning room, transforming the elegant space into a makeshift operating theater. The sight of surgical instruments gleaming under the lamplight made Elena's blood run cold, but she forced herself to remain calm and observant. "We'll need to sedate her before moving to the surgical suite," Dr. Ashworth announced, preparing a syringe with practiced efficiency. "The procedure requires absolute stillness, and psychological resistance can cause dangerous complications." Elena knew this was her last chance. Once sedated, she would be completely helpless as Dr. Ashworth systematically destroyed her brain. She tensed her muscles, preparing to slip her restraints and fight for her life. But before she could act, an unexpected interruption changed everything. A loud crash echoed through the house, followed by shouting voices and the sound of splintering. "It would! Someone was breaking down the front door." "Federal agents!" came a booming voice from the main hall. "Search warrant for these premises." Elena's heart soared with desperate hope, but her relief was short-lived. Dr. Ashworth reacted with chilling efficiency, grabbing the prepared syringe and lunging toward Elena's bed. "Not yet," the doctor hissed, "but soon enough." Elena slipped her restraints and rolled away from the approaching needle, tumbling off the bed onto the floor. Dr. Ashworth pursued her, syringe extended like a weapon, while Marcus stood frozen. In shock, the sounds of the federal raid grew louder as agents spread throughout the house. Elena could hear doors being kicked open, furniture overturned, and authoritative voices demanding surrender. But the morning room was hidden deep within the cabin's interior, and the thick walls muffled the sounds of her struggle with Dr. Ashworth. Elena grabbed a porcelain doll from one of the shelves and hurled it at Dr. Ashworth's head. The figurine shattered against the wall, but the distraction allowed Elena to dart toward the door. Her freedom lasted only seconds before Marcus recovered from his paralysis and blocked her escape route. "Don't make this harder than necessary," he pleaded, his voice breaking with desperation. "The agents will find you eventually. But if the surgery is already complete, you'll be safe from prosecution. You won't remember enough to testify against us." Elena realized that Marcus genuinely believed he was protecting her by destroying her identity. His warped psychology had convinced him that lobotomy was preferable to the trauma of testifying against her captors. Dr. Ashworth advanced again with the syringe, her medical training evident in the calculated way she moved to corner Elena. But as she raised the needle, Sarah suddenly stepped forward. "Doctor," Sarah said in her usual hollow voice, "the agents are approaching this section of the house. Perhaps we should—" Instead of finishing her sentence, Sarah struck Dr. Ashworth's wrist with surprising force, sending the syringe flying across the room. The transformed woman's blank expression flickered and changed, revealing desperate intelligence underneath. "Run!" Sarah gasped, her voice suddenly alive with emotion. "The surgical suite, she has others there, still alive, but—" Dr. Ashworth backhanded Sarah across the face, sending her crashing into the wall. "Defective conditioning," she snarled. "I warned you that psychological methods were unreliable." But Sarah's moment of rebellion had given Elena the opening she needed. She rushed past the stunned Marcus and burst through the door into the hallway, shouting at the top of her lungs, "Help, federal agents! I'm here! I'm Elena Martinez!" Heavy footsteps thundered through the house as agents converged on her location. Elena ran toward the sounds, desperate to reach safety before Dr. Ashworth could recapture her. She rounded a corner and collided with a tall man in a dark suit who caught her before she could fall. The badge on his coat identified him as Deputy U.S. Marshal William Crawford, and his kind eyes held the first genuine compassion Elena had seen in days. "Elena Martinez?" he asked urgently. "We've been looking for you. Are you injured?" "Dr. Ashworth, she has surgical equipment. She was going to operate on my brain," Elena gasped, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "There are others, still alive, in a surgical suite somewhere in the house." Marshal Crawford's expression hardened. He spoke rapidly into a wireless communication device, calling for backup and medical assistance. Within minutes, the cabin was swarming with federal agents, medical personnel, and local law enforcement officers who weren't part of the conspiracy. Dr. Ashworth and Marcus were arrested within the hour, both found hiding in a secret room behind. The locked door Elena had noticed during her first tour of the cabin. The hidden chamber contained detailed records of their 23-year operation, names, dates, photographs, and financial transactions that documented hundreds of victims. But the most horrific discovery was the surgical suite Sarah had mentioned. Hidden in a converted barn behind the main house, federal agents found 3 women in various stages of Dr. Ashworth's modification process. 2 were catatonic, their personalities destroyed by surgical intervention, but the 3rd showed signs of recovery potential. Sarah herself presented a complex case. Dr. Ashworth's conditioning had been layered over her original personality rather than completely replacing it, creating a fragmented consciousness that could occasionally break through the artificial programming. With time and proper medical care, doctors believed some of her original identity might be recoverable. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the trafficking network. Dr. Ashworth had been operating similar facilities in 3 other states, using Marcus's cabin as her primary research center for developing surgical modification techniques. Sheriff Hayes and several other local officials had been accepting regular payments to facilitate the operation and cover up suspicious disappearances. Elena's testimony became crucial to the prosecution's case. Her detailed observations of the psychological conditioning process, the power dynamics between the conspirators, and the systematic nature of their crimes provided investigators with insights they couldn't have obtained any other way. During the trial, Elena learned that Thomas had indeed tried to warn her. His final letters, which had seemed strange and possessive, were actually coded messages attempting to alert her to the danger without triggering Marcus's suspicion. When Marcus discovered Thomas's attempts at communication, the confrontation had escalated into violence. The federal investigation had been triggered by a former victim who managed to escape from a facility in Nevada. Though her memories were fragmented due to partial conditioning, she had retained enough information to describe the mail-order bride recruitment strategy and the surgical modification procedures. Elena also discovered that her own recruitment hadn't been random. Dr. Ashworth had been specifically seeking women with particular psychological profiles, intelligence, resilience, and social isolation that made them ideal subjects for long-term conditioning projects. Elena's survival of her family's death and her ability to function independently in Chicago had made her a prime target. As the legal proceedings concluded, Elena faced the challenge of rebuilding her life. The experience had left her with profound trauma, but also with an unexpected strength. She had survived something that destroyed most of its victims, and her testimony had helped bring justice to hundreds of women who couldn't speak for themselves. Marshall Crawford helped Elena relocate to San Francisco, where she found work with a private investigation agency specializing in missing persons cases. Her experience with the trafficking network made her uniquely qualified to recognize patterns of predatory behavior and psychological manipulation. Elena maintained correspondence with Sarah, whose recovery proved more successful than anyone had predicted. Though she never fully recovered her pre-conditioning memories, Sarah regained enough of her original personality to live independently and eventually testified against Dr. Ashworth's associates in related cases. The Blackwood cabin was burned to the ground by federal agents after evidence collection was complete. Elena attended the controlled destruction, watching the flames consume the morning room where she had nearly lost her identity forever. The sight brought closure to a chapter of her life she would never forget, but was finally able to move beyond. But even as Elena rebuilt her life in California, she knew that Dr. Ashworth's network had been vast and that other facilities likely remained undiscovered. Her work with the investigation agency focused on finding these hidden operations and bringing their victims home. The woman who had traveled to Colorado as a desperate mail-order bride had been transformed by her experiences, but not in the way her captors had intended. Instead of becoming a victim, Elena Martinez had become a hunter, someone dedicated to ensuring that no other woman would suffer the fate she had so narrowly escaped. The nightmares still came sometimes, filled with surgical instruments and blank-eyed dolls watching from shadowy shelves. But Eleanor faced them with the knowledge that she had not only survived, but had struck a decisive blow against those who preyed on the vulnerable and alone. In the end, Marcus and Dr. Ashworth had succeeded in transforming her, but into someone far more dangerous to their kind than they could ever have imagined. 3 months after the trials concluded, Elena Martinez stood in the rain outside a dilapidated warehouse in Portland, Oregon. The anonymous tip had come through the private investigation agency where she now worked. Another facility, another network of missing women, another chance to prevent what had nearly happened to her in Colorado. Detective Ray Morrison of the Portland Police Department emerged from an unmarked car, his weathered face grim with determination. Elena had worked with Morrison on 2 previous cases, and he'd learned to trust her instincts about trafficking operations. "What do we have?" Morrison asked, pulling his coat tighter against the October drizzle. Elena studied the warehouse through binoculars, noting the reinforced windows and the unusual number of electrical cables running into the building. Same pattern as the Ashworth facilities. Isolated location, heavy power consumption, suggesting medical equipment, and local authorities who seem remarkably uninterested in investigating. Morrison nodded grimly. "Captain Williams has been blocking my requests for search warrants for 3 weeks. Claims we don't have sufficient evidence, but I've seen him approve raids on much thinner intelligence." Eleanor had encountered similar resistance in previous cases. Dr. Ashworth's network had been extensive, with corruption reaching into law enforcement agencies across multiple states. Even with the primary conspirators imprisoned, their associates and clients remained active, protected by carefully cultivated official indifference. "We need inside information," Elena said. "Someone who can confirm what's happening in there, before we can build a case strong enough to overcome the interference." "I might have a solution," Morrison replied. "My partner's been working a missing persons case. Jennifer Walsh disappeared 6 months ago after answering a newspaper advertisement for domestic work. The advertisement traced back to a mail service box registered to this address." Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition. The pattern was evolving, but remained essentially unchanged. Vulnerable women lured by promises of employment or marriage, then disappeared into facilities where their identities were systematically destroyed. Any other disappearances connected to this location? Elena asked. Morrison consulted his notebook. "At least 4 in the past year, all matching similar profiles. Young, no immediate family, recently unemployed or facing financial hardship. The kind of women society barely notices when they vanish." Elena's jaw tightened. That casual dismissal of society's most vulnerable members was exactly what had made Dr. Ashworth's operation possible for over 2 decades. Women without strong social connections became invisible victims, their disappearances attributed to voluntary relocation or personal choices rather than criminal activity. A movement at one of the warehouse windows caught Elena's attention. A pale face appeared briefly behind the reinforced glass, then quickly withdrew. Female, young, with the hollow-eyed expression Elena recognized from her own time in captivity. "There's someone in there," she told Morrison. "Upper floor, 3rd window from the left. Looked like a young woman, possibly one of the missing persons." Morrison raised his own binoculars. "I don't see anyone now, but that doesn't mean you're wrong. The question is how we get inside without alerting whoever's running the operation." Elena had been thinking about that problem since arriving in Portland. Standard police procedures were too slow and too visible. By the time warrants were obtained and raids organized, the facility would be cleaned out and the victims moved or worse. "What if we created a situation that required immediate police intervention?" Elena suggested. "Something that would justify entering the building without a warrant?" Morrison looked interested but cautious. "What kind of situation? A fire alarm? Maybe. Or reports of someone inside calling for help, something that would classify as an emergency response rather than an investigation." Before Morrison could respond, both investigators froze as they heard something that made Elena's blood run cold, a woman's scream echoing from inside the warehouse, cut short as if muffled by force. "That's our emergency," Morrison said grimly, reaching for his radio. "All units, we have reports of a woman in distress at 1247 Industrial Boulevard, requesting immediate backup and medical assistance." As they waited for additional officers to arrive, Eleanor studied the warehouse more carefully. Unlike the Blackwood cabin's rustic isolation, this facility was hidden in plain sight among Portland's industrial district. The setup suggested a more sophisticated operation than Marcus's psychological conditioning center. "This feels different," Elena told Morrison. "More organized, more professional. Whoever's running this place learned from Ashworth's mistakes." Morrison nodded. "The intelligence we've gathered suggests this is part of a larger network that reorganized after the Colorado arrests. They're using more advanced medical techniques and stricter security protocols. The backup units arrived within minutes. 3 patrol cars and an ambulance, their occupants briefed on the potential trafficking situation." Elena noticed that several of the responding officers seemed reluctant to participate, their body language suggesting they'd prefer to be anywhere else. "Some of your colleagues don't seem enthusiastic about this operation," Elena observed. Morrison's expression darkened. "Portland Police Department has the same corruption problems we found in Colorado. Not everyone wearing a badge is interested in justice." As the team prepared to enter the warehouse, Elena equipped herself with a digital recorder and camera. Her testimony had been crucial in the Ashworth trials, but physical evidence would be even more valuable in building cases against the remaining network members. The warehouse's front entrance was secured with multiple locks and electronic surveillance equipment. But Detective Morrison had come prepared. A specialized entry team quickly circumvented the security measures and gained access to the building's interior. What they found inside exceeded Elena's worst expectations. The warehouse had been converted into a sophisticated medical facility, complete with operating theaters, recovery rooms, and holding cells disguised as patient quarters. Unlike Dr. Ashworth's crude surgical suite, this facility represented millions of dollars in equipment and preparation. Elena counted at least a dozen women in various stages of the modification process. Some appeared heavily sedated, lying motionless in hospital-style beds, surrounded by monitoring equipment. Others showed signs of recent surgery, bandaged heads, vacant expressions, the telltale indicators of neurological intervention. But what disturbed Elena most was the presence of children among the victims. 3 girls who couldn't have been older than 16 were housed in a separate section of the facility, their files indicating they were being prepared for specialized conditioning programs. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered, his professional composure cracking as he surveyed the scope of the operation. "This isn't just trafficking, it's industrial-scale human modification." Elena photographed everything, documenting the medical equipment, patient files, and computerized records that detailed the systematic destruction of human identity. The files revealed that this facility processed over 50 victims per year, with subjects shipped to clients across the country and internationally. The investigation was interrupted by the arrival of the facility's staff. Unlike Marcus's isolated operation, this warehouse employed professional medical personnel who had adapted their skills to criminal purposes. Dr. Helen Vaughan, the facility's director, attempted to claim that the operation was a legitimate psychiatric hospital treating severe mental illness. These patients suffer from dissociative identity disorder and related conditions, Dr. Vaughan explained smoothly. Our treatments help them develop more functional personality structures. Elena recognized the sophisticated lies immediately. Dr. Vaughan, was using genuine medical terminology to disguise the same systematic destruction of identity that Dr. Ashworth had pioneered, but with more advanced techniques and better legal camouflage. "And the children?" Elena asked pointedly. "What psychiatric conditions require modifying the personalities of 16-year-old girls?" Dr. Vaughan's composure slipped slightly. "Those patients have been referred by family court systems for treatment of severe behavioral disorders. All procedures are conducted with proper legal authorization, but Elena had learned to recognize forged documentation during her previous cases. The court orders authorizing treatment were skillfully counterfeited, but they contained subtle errors that revealed their fraudulent nature. As the investigation continued, Elena discovered that this facility represented a new phase in the trafficking network's evolution. Instead of relying on individual operators like Marcus, the organization had developed a corporate structure with professional management, standardized procedures, and legitimate medical credentials that provided cover for their activities. The clients had evolved as well. Rather than simply purchasing compliant companions, buyers could now specify exact personality characteristics, skills, and even memories they wanted installed in their acquisitions. The facility maintained catalogs of available modifications, like a grotesque shopping menu for human identity. Elena found herself face to face with one of the victims, a young woman named Amanda Chen, whose files indicated she had been in the facility for 8 months. Amanda's original personality had been almost completely erased, replaced with an artificial identity programmed to serve as a domestic companion for a wealthy client in Seattle. "Amanda," Elena said gently, "do you remember your life before coming here?" The young woman's response was chillingly familiar. The same hollow voice, the same mechanical compliance that Elena had seen in Sarah back in Colorado. But unlike Sarah, Amanda showed no flickers of underlying consciousness, no signs that any part of her original self remained intact. "I don't understand the question," Amanda replied with programmed confusion. "I've always been here, receiving treatment for my condition. The doctors are helping me become a better person." Elena realized that the new techniques were more thorough than Dr. Ashworth's crude surgical methods. These victims weren't just conditioned, they were completely rebuilt from the ground up, with artificial memories and personalities so comprehensive that they genuinely believed their modified identities were real. The scope of the horror became clear as Elena reviewed more files. The facility maintained detailed psychological profiles of each victim, analyzing their fears, desires, and personality traits before systematically replacing them with characteristics designed to appeal to specific clients. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. As Elena explored deeper into the facility's records, she found evidence that the network was expanding beyond individual trafficking. They were experimenting with mass modification techniques, preparing to process victims in larger numbers for clients who needed multiple subjects with identical characteristics. One file detailed a contract with an overseas buyer who had ordered 20 women modified to identical specifications, same personality traits, same skills, same programmed loyalties. The facility was preparing to fulfill this order by kidnapping women from homeless shelters and foster care systems, targeting society's most vulnerable members for industrial-scale identity destruction. Elena's investigation was interrupted by an unexpected complication. Captain Williams arrived at the warehouse with a court order demanding that all evidence be turned over to federal authorities, claiming that the local investigation was interfering with a classified operation. Detective Morrison studied the court order with growing suspicion. This doesn't make sense. Federal agencies don't use local court systems to shut down trafficking investigations. They coordinate through proper channels. Elena recognized the pattern from previous cases, official obstruction disguised as legitimate procedure. Captain Williams was almost certainly compromised, acting to protect the trafficking network from exposure. "We need to get this evidence to honest federal agents before it disappears," Elena told Morrison. "I have contacts from the Colorado case who can ensure it reaches the right people." But as they prepared to leave the warehouse, Elena made one final discovery that changed everything. Hidden in Dr. Vaughan's private office was a list of planned expansion sites, 12 additional facilities in development across the western United States, each designed to process hundreds of victims annually. The trafficking network wasn't just continuing Dr. Ashworth's work. They were scaling it up into a systematic industry for the mass production of modified human beings. Elena realized that stopping this single facility would barely slow down an operation that had grown far beyond anything Marcus or Dr. Ashworth had ever imagined. As federal agents arrived to take custody of the evidence, Elena made a grim decision. The official investigation would follow legal procedures, gathering evidence and building cases that might take years to resolve. But Elena had learned that some situations required more direct action. She quietly pocketed copies of the expansion, site list and Dr. Vaughan's client records. The legal system had failed to prevent Dr. Ashworth's crimes for over 2 decades, and Elena wasn't willing to trust it to handle this escalated threat. That night, Elena placed encrypted calls to contacts she'd developed during her work with the investigation agency, former law enforcement officers, private investigators, and other trafficking survivors who shared her commitment to direct action against networks that preyed on the vulnerable. Within a week, Eleanor had assembled a team of specialists dedicated to hunting down the remaining facilities before they could process their intended victims. The official investigation would continue through proper channels, but Elena's group would work outside the system to ensure that bureaucratic delays didn't cost more lives. Standing in her San Francisco apartment, studying maps and photographs of the suspected facility locations, Elena reflected on how far she'd traveled from the desperate woman who had boarded a train to Colorado seeking a new beginning. The mail-order bride who had nearly lost her identity to Marcus's psychological conditioning had become someone dedicated to ensuring no other woman would face the same fate. But as Eleanor planned her next move against the trafficking network, she couldn't shake the feeling that even larger horrors remained undiscovered. The industrial-scale modifications she'd witnessed in Portland suggested an organization with resources and ambitions that extended far beyond anything law enforcement had yet uncovered. Elena Martinez had survived her encounter with evil and transformed it into a mission to protect others. But the war against those who would steal human identity and dignity was far from over, and Elena suspected that her most dangerous battles still lay ahead. 6 weeks after the Portland warehouse raid, Elena Martinez sat in a dimly lit diner in Phoenix, Arizona, studying surveillance photographs spread across the worn Formica table. Across from her, Jack Thornton, a former FBI agent turned private security consultant, pointed to a series of images showing well-dressed individuals entering an upscale medical clinic. "Whitmore Medical Center," Thornton explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "On the surface, it's a legitimate cosmetic surgery practice catering to wealthy clients. But our intelligence suggests it's the headquarters for the entire Western trafficking network." Elena examined the photographs more closely. Unlike the crude facilities she'd encountered in Colorado and Portland, this operation was hidden behind a facade of medical respectability. The clinic occupied an entire floor of a prestigious downtown office building, complete with marble lobbies and valet parking. "How do we know it's connected to the network?" Eleanor asked. Thornton slid another photograph across the table. A telephoto shot of Dr. Helen Vaughan from the Portland facility walking into the clinic. She wasn't arrested in the warehouse raid, managed to slip away during the confusion and disappear for 3 weeks. Then our surveillance picked her up here, meeting with the clinic's director. Elena felt the familiar surge of anger she experienced whenever the network's tentacles revealed themselves. Dr. Vaughan had orchestrated the systematic destruction of dozens of human minds, yet she was walking free and apparently continuing her work. "Who's running this place?" Elena inquired. "Dr. Marcus Sterling," Thornton replied, producing a professional headshot of a distinguished man in his 50s. Harvard-trained surgeon, published researcher in neurology and psychology, impeccable reputation in medical circles. If we're right about his involvement, he represents a new level of sophistication in the trafficking network. Elena studied Dr. Sterling's photograph, noting the confidence in his expression and the expensive cut of his clothing. This wasn't another Marcus Blackwood, an isolated predator operating from a remote cabin. Dr. Sterling had integrated his criminal activities into the highest levels of legitimate society. "What's our approach?" Elena asked. Thornton hesitated. "That's where things get complicated. We've been trying to place an undercover operative inside the clinic for weeks, but their security screening is incredibly thorough. They run background checks that go back decades, verify every detail of an applicant's history, and require references from multiple sources." Elena understood the implication. The network had learned from the failures in Colorado and Portland, implementing safeguards that made traditional investigative techniques nearly impossible. "But," Thornton continued, "there might be another way. The clinic has been advertising for specialized nursing staff with experience in psychological rehabilitation. The position requires someone with genuine medical training and a documented history of working with trauma patients." Elena frowned. "I don't have medical training." "No, but Sarah Chen does." The mention of Sarah's name made Elena's pulse quicken. She had maintained regular contact with the woman who had helped her escape from Marcus's cabin, supporting Sarah's gradual recovery from psychological conditioning. But involving Sarah in an active investigation seemed both dangerous and potentially re-traumatizing. "She's still fragile," Eleanor protested. "The conditioning left her with significant trust issues and memory problems. Exposing her to another trafficking facility could trigger a complete psychological breakdown." Thornton nodded sympathetically. "I understand the risks, but Sarah has something none of our other operatives possess: genuine experience as a conditioning victim. She knows the techniques, the warning signs, the psychological patterns that these operations use. That knowledge makes her uniquely qualified to recognize what's happening inside the clinic." Eleanor considered the proposal carefully. Sarah had made remarkable progress in her recovery, regaining much of her original personality and developing new coping mechanisms. But she remained vulnerable to psychological manipulation, and Elena worried that exposure to another trafficking operation might undo months of healing. "Have you discussed this with Sarah herself?" Elena asked. "She's the one who suggested it," Thornton replied, surprising Eleanor. "When we told her about the clinic, she immediately volunteered to go undercover. She said she couldn't live with herself knowing that other women were suffering the same fate she barely escaped." Elena felt a mixture of pride and concern. Sarah's willingness to risk her own safety to help other victims demonstrated remarkable courage, but it also reflected the psychological scars left by her ordeal. Survivors of trafficking often developed an overwhelming need to protect others, sometimes at the expense of their own well-being. What kind of support would she have? Elena inquired. Thornton outlined a comprehensive backup plan. Sarah would be equipped with hidden recording devices and emergency communication equipment. Elena would maintain constant surveillance from outside the clinic, ready to intervene if Sarah signaled distress. And Detective Morrison had agreed to position Portland police units nearby, prepared for immediate response. Despite the precautions, Elena remained uneasy about the plan. She had seen how quickly trafficking operations could identify and neutralize threats. If Dr. Sterling's organization was as sophisticated as their intelligence suggested, Sarah might be walking into a trap far more dangerous than anything Marcus Blackwood had devised. 2 days later, Eleanor found herself sitting in a rental car, across from the Whitmore Medical Center, watching Sarah enter the building for her job interview. Despite her concerns, Elena had to admit that Sarah looked convincing. Professional medical attire, confident posture, and a carefully constructed resume documenting her experience in psychiatric rehabilitation. The interview lasted 3 hours, far longer than Elena had expected. Through high-powered binoculars, Elena could see movement on the clinic's upper floors, but the tinted windows prevented her from observing specific activities. All she could do was wait and hope that Sarah's conditioning survival skills would protect her from whatever psychological assessments Dr. Sterling was conducting. When Sarah finally emerged from the building, her expression was carefully neutral. She walked to a predetermined meeting location, a coffee shop 6 blocks away, where Eleanor waited anxiously for her report. "I got the job," Sarah announced quietly, sliding into the booth across from Eleanor. "I start tomorrow morning." Eleanor studied Sarah's face for signs of distress or psychological manipulation. "How do you feel about the interview? Did anything seem familiar or threatening?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Dr. Sterling is incredibly charming and persuasive. I could feel him analyzing my responses, probing for psychological vulnerabilities. But his techniques are more subtle than what Marcus used, less obvious coercion, more sophisticated manipulation." Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. The network was evolving, learning from each exposure to develop more effective methods of control and concealment. "What kind of work did he describe?" Elena asked. "Patient rehabilitation, following what he called therapeutic personality restructuring," Sarah replied. "He explained that they help people overcome traumatic backgrounds by constructing healthier identity frameworks. The terminology was different, but the underlying concept was identical to what happened to me in Colorado." Elena realized they were dealing with the next generation of trafficking technology, psychological modification disguised as legitimate therapy, conducted by credentialed professionals in respectable medical facilities. "Did you see any other patients or staff members?" Elena inquired. Sarah nodded grimly. "Several young women in the waiting area, all with the same vacant expression I recognize from my own conditioning period. And I overheard part of a conversation between Dr. Sterling and Dr. Vaughan about accelerating production schedules to meet increased client demand." The phrase "production schedules" confirmed Elena's worst fears. The network wasn't just continuing its trafficking activities, it was expanding operations to meet growing market demand for modified human beings. Over the following week, Sarah gathered disturbing intelligence about the clinic's operations. Unlike the crude facilities Elena had encountered previously, the Whitmore Medical Center represented a fully industrialized approach to human trafficking and identity modification. The clinic processed victims through a systematic assembly line of psychological and medical interventions. New arrivals underwent comprehensive personality assessment, followed by targeted conditioning designed to break down their original identities. Advanced surgical techniques were then used to install artificial memories and behavioral patterns, customized to specific client requirements. But the most horrifying discovery was the scope of the client base. Sarah's covert recordings revealed that the network served customers ranging from wealthy individuals seeking compliant companions to corporate entities requiring specialized workers with particular psychological profiles. They're not just trafficking women anymore, Sarah reported during one of their clandestine meetings. I've seen files for male victims, children, and even elderly subjects. They're modifying anyone who fits their client's specifications. Elena realized the network had evolved beyond the sexual trafficking that had characterized Dr. Ashworth's operation. They were now engaged in wholesale human modification for any purpose that generated profit. Domestic service, specialized labor, even creating artificial families for clients who wanted children with specific characteristics. The intelligence gathering was interrupted when Sarah discovered that she was being monitored more closely than expected. Dr. Sterling had apparently noticed subtle inconsistencies in her behavior that suggested she wasn't genuinely committed to the clinic's mission. He's testing me, Sarah reported urgently, asking me to participate in procedures that I know are designed to gauge my psychological compliance. If I refuse, he'll know I'm not who I claim to be. But if I participate, I'll be helping to destroy other people's minds. Elena faced an agonizing decision. Extracting Sarah immediately would protect her from further danger, but would also end their investigation before they had gathered sufficient evidence to shut down the entire network. Allowing Sarah to continue her undercover work might expose crucial intelligence, but could result in her recapture and renewed conditioning. The decision was made for them when Sarah discovered that Dr. Sterling was planning to use her as subject for a new experimental procedure. Under the guise of treating her residual trauma from previous psychiatric treatment, he intended to modify Sarah's recovered memories and personality, essentially completing the conditioning process that Marcus had begun years earlier. They've scheduled the procedure for tomorrow morning, Sarah reported in a panicked phone call. Dr. Sterling says it will help me overcome my lingering psychological instabilities, but I know what he's really planning to do. Eleanor immediately contacted Thornton and Detective Morrison, activating their emergency response plan. But as they prepared to raid the clinic, Elena realized they faced a critical problem. Dr. Sterling's operation was protected by layers of legal legitimacy that would make it difficult to prove criminal activity. Unlike the isolated warehouse facility in Portland, the Whitmore Medical Center operated with proper licenses, accredited staff, and documentation that appeared to support their claim of providing legitimate psychiatric treatment. Even if they rescued Sarah and the other victims, proving that the procedures constituted trafficking rather than therapy would require extensive investigation and legal proceedings. Elena decided that the time for working within the system had passed. While Thornton and Morrison prepared their official response, Elena implemented her own plan to ensure that Dr. Sterling's operation was permanently shut down. That night, Elena infiltrated the clinic using skills she'd developed during her months of investigating trafficking networks. Her objective wasn't just to rescue Sarah and the other victims. She intended to gather evidence so comprehensive and damning that no amount of legal maneuvering could protect the network's leaders. What Elena discovered inside the clinic exceeded even her worst expectations. The facility's basement level contained a sophisticated laboratory where researchers were developing new techniques for psychological modification. Files documented experiments in mass conditioning, genetic manipulation of behavior patterns, and the creation of artificially intelligent personality frameworks that could be installed in human subjects. Elena realized she was looking at the future of human trafficking, industrial-scale modification of human consciousness using cutting-edge technology that made Dr. Ashworth's crude surgical methods seem primitive by comparison. As Elena documented the evidence, she discovered that the network's ambitions extended far beyond individual trafficking. They were developing techniques for modifying entire populations, creating compliant workforces for authoritarian governments and corporate entities that valued control over human dignity. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Research, facilities in multiple countries, political connections at the highest levels, and financial backing from sources that included both criminal organizations and legitimate corporations seeking new forms of human capital. Elena understood that she had uncovered something far more dangerous than a trafficking network. She was looking at the early stages of a systematic assault on human consciousness itself, conducted by individuals who viewed free will and individual identity as obstacles to be eliminated rather than rights to be protected. As dawn approached, and Dr. Sterling prepared to begin Sarah's treatment, Elena knew that the confrontation ahead would determine not just the fate of the current victims, but the future of human freedom itself. The mail-order bride, who had once been helpless in Marcus's cabin, was about to face the most important battle of her life, a struggle to preserve the essence of what made people human in the face of those who would reduce them to programmable commodities. The final phase of Elena's transformation from victim to protector was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. Elena moved through the Whitmore Medical Center's corridors like a ghost, her years of investigating trafficking networks having taught her to navigate secure facilities without triggering alarms. The building's sophisticated security system was designed to keep intruders out, but Elena had learned that most defenses focused on external threats rather than someone already inside. The basement laboratory she'd discovered contained horrors that defied comprehension. Banks of computers processed psychological profiles of thousands of potential victims, analyzing social media posts, employment records, and personal relationships to identify individuals who could disappear without generating significant investigation. The scope was breathtaking. Hundreds of thousands of people had been catalogued and ranked according to their suitability for modification. Elena photographed everything, knowing that exposing this industrial-scale approach to human trafficking would require evidence so overwhelming that no court could dismiss it. The files revealed connections to pharmaceutical companies developing consciousness-altering drugs, technology firms creating artificial intelligence systems for personality implantation, and government agencies exploring applications for population control. As she documented the evidence, Elena heard footsteps approaching the laboratory. She quickly concealed herself behind a bank of servers as Dr. Sterling entered, accompanied by Dr. Vaughan and two other individuals Elena didn't recognize. "The Chen subject presents an interesting challenge," Dr. Sterling was saying. "Her previous conditioning was crude but extensive. We'll need to completely strip away the recovered memories before installing the new personality framework." Elena's blood ran cold as she realized they were discussing Sarah's impending procedure. Her friend was upstairs, probably sedated and prepared for surgery that would destroy everything she had fought to rebuild over the past months. "What about the timeline?" asked one of the unknown individuals, a woman with a harsh accent that Elena couldn't place. "Our clients in Eastern Europe are expecting delivery of the first batch within 6 weeks." Dr. Sterling nodded confidently. "Production schedules are on track. The new assembly line approach allows us to process 12 subjects simultaneously. We'll have 40 modified individuals ready for shipment by the deadline." Elena realized. She was listening to a business meeting where human beings were discussed like manufactured products. The casual way these people planned the systematic destruction of human consciousness demonstrated a level of evil that exceeded even Dr. Ashworth's. Crimes. "Security concerns?" inquired the fourth person, a man whose expensive suit couldn't disguise his military bearing. Dr. Vaughan responded, "The Martinez woman remains at large, but our intelligence suggests she's working alone or with minimal support. Local law enforcement has been instructed to treat any investigation as potential terrorism, which should discourage official interference." Elena felt a chill as she realized the network had not only identified her activities, but had also developed countermeasures to neutralize law enforcement response. The corruption she'd encountered in Colorado and Portland was apparently part of a systematic campaign to protect the network's operations. "What about federal agencies?" the military man pressed. Dr. Sterling smiled coldly. "We have assets placed strategically throughout relevant departments. Any investigation that threatens our operations will be redirected or terminated before it can gather momentum. The beauty of our current position is that we appear to be legitimate medical professionals, providing innovative psychiatric treatment." Elena understood that the network had achieved something far more dangerous than simple criminal enterprise. They had embedded themselves so deeply within legitimate institutions that distinguishing between legal and illegal activities had become nearly impossible. The meeting concluded with the conspirators agreeing to accelerate their timeline. Elena waited until they left before emerging from her hiding place, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd overheard. Sarah's procedure was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours, and Elena was apparently the only person capable of stopping it. She made her way to the upper floors of the clinic, where patient rooms were located. The facility's design was subtly disturbing. While appearing like a luxury medical center, it contained features that Elena recognized from previous trafficking sites. Reinforced doors, security cameras positioned to monitor patient movements, and staff areas that could quickly be sealed off from the rest of the building. Elena found Sarah in a pre-surgical preparation room, connected to an IV drip that was clearly more than a simple saline solution. Her friend's eyes were glassy but alert, indicating that the sedatives were designed to impair resistance while maintaining consciousness during the upcoming procedure. "Elena?" Sarah whispered, her voice slurred but recognizable. "What are you doing here? Getting you out," Elena replied, quickly examining the IV setup to determine how to safely disconnect it. "Sterling isn't planning to treat your trauma. He's going to complete the conditioning process that Marcus started." Sarah tried to sit up, but found her movements uncoordinated. "I know. I heard them talking about installing a compliance service, personality designed for a client who specifically requested someone with my physical characteristics and modified psychological profile." Elena felt sick as she realized Sarah was being prepared for sale to someone who had ordered her specific features and personality traits like items from a catalog. The level of dehumanization was beyond anything she had encountered in previous cases. As Elena worked to free Sarah from the medical restraints, an alarm began sounding throughout the building. Red lights flashed in the corridors, and Elena could hear security personnel mobilizing in response to what appeared to be a facility-wide alert. "Did you trigger something?" Sarah asked, her speech becoming clearer as Elena replaced the drugged IV with plain saline. Elena shook her head. "I was careful to avoid all the security systems. Something else must have—" The answer came in the form of Detective Morrison's voice, echoing through the building's intercom system. "This is the Portland Police Department. We have the building surrounded. All personnel are to cease current activities and report to the main lobby for processing." Elena realized that Thornton and Morrison had implemented their official raid, despite her request to delay until she could gather more evidence. While she appreciated their concern for Sarah's safety, the timing couldn't have been worse. Dr. Sterling and his associates would now have time to destroy crucial evidence and escape prosecution. "We need to get to the laboratory," Elena told Sarah urgently. "There's evidence down there that could shut down the entire network, but they'll destroy it if we don't preserve it immediately." Sarah struggled to stand, her balance still compromised by the sedatives. "I can make it, but Elena, there's something else you need to know. This facility isn't just a treatment center, it's a training ground for expanding the network internationally." Elena helped Sarah toward the door while processing this new information. "What kind of training?" "They're teaching the techniques to representatives from organizations in other countries," Sarah explained. "I overheard conversations about facilities being established in South America, Asia, and Eastern Europe. This network isn't just American, it's becoming global." The implications were staggering. Elena had been thinking of Dr. Sterling's operation as an escalation of the trafficking she'd encountered in Colorado and Portland, but it was actually the hub of an international conspiracy to systematically modify human consciousness on a massive scale. As they made their way toward the laboratory, Elena and Sarah encountered increasing resistance from the clinic's security forces. Unlike the local law enforcement corruption Elena had faced previously, these were professional operatives who moved with military precision and showed no hesitation about using lethal force to protect the facility. Elena realized that Dr. Sterling's network had resources that went far beyond anything she had imagined. The security team was equipped with advanced weapons and communication equipment, and their tactics suggested extensive training in counterintelligence operations. "This isn't just a medical facility," Elena told Sarah as they took cover from security forces in a supply closet. "It's a paramilitary operation disguised as a clinic." Sarah nodded grimly. "Sterling mentioned something about strategic partnerships with national security agencies. I think some government departments are involved in funding and protecting this network." Elena felt the weight of realization settling over her. She wasn't just fighting a criminal organization, she was confronting a conspiracy that involved elements of the government itself. The network's ability to operate with impunity, despite multiple exposures, suddenly made sense. The sounds of combat grew closer as Portland police engaged with the clinic's security forces. Eleanor could hear automatic weapons fire and what sounded like explosive devices, indicating that the facility's defenders were prepared for military-level confrontation. Morrison and his team are outgunned, Elena realized. Sterling's people are treating this like a war zone, not a law enforcement operation. Through the supply closet's small window, Elena could see figures moving on the building's roof. Additional security personnel preparing defensive positions with what appeared to be military-grade equipment. The Whitmore Medical Center was revealed to be a fortress designed to withstand serious assault. Elena made a desperate decision. While Sarah remained hidden in the supply closet, Elena would attempt to reach the laboratory and transmit the crucial evidence to external contacts before the facility's defenders could destroy it. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was allowing the network to escape and continue its expansion. "I'm going to try to reach the computers downstairs," Elena told Sarah. "If I don't make it back, tell Morrison about the international connections and the government involvement. This conspiracy is bigger than anyone realized." Sarah grabbed Elena's arm with surprising strength. "Don't go alone. We've survived this much together. We finish it together." Elena was about to protest when the supply closet door exploded inward. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, flanked by armed security personnel and holding a military-style assault rifle. With practiced familiarity, "Ms. Martinez," he said with cold satisfaction, "I was wondering when you would finally reveal yourself. Your interference has been a persistent annoyance, but it ends today." Elena positioned herself between Dr. Sterling and Sarah, her mind racing through possible escape scenarios. But the odds were overwhelming. They were trapped in a small room with no exit and facing multiple armed opponents. "You're making a mistake, Doctor," Elena said, hoping to buy time. "The police know about your operation. Federal agencies are investigating. Even if you eliminate us, the network will be exposed." Dr. Sterling laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. "Ms. Martinez, you still don't understand the scope of what you're dealing with. This network doesn't just operate despite government knowledge. It operates with government support. We provide services that certain agencies find extremely valuable." Elena felt her last hopes crumbling as she realized the full extent of the conspiracy. The network wasn't just protected by corruption, it was an integral part of covert government operations that required the systematic modification of human consciousness. Population control, industrial espionage, political manipulation, all of these activities are enhanced by having access to modified human assets, Dr. Sterling continued. "We don't just traffic in individual victims anymore. We create customized human resources for strategic applications." Sarah stepped forward despite her weakened condition. "You're talking about slavery on an industrial scale." "I'm talking about evolution," Dr. Sterling corrected. "The natural development of human society toward more efficient organizational structures. Individual consciousness is a primitive concept that creates unnecessary conflict and inefficiency. We're simply helping humanity move beyond such limitations." Elena realized she was confronting not just a criminal, but a true believer in systematic dehumanization. Dr. Sterling genuinely believed that destroying individual identity was beneficial to society, making him far more dangerous than someone motivated purely by profit. The philosophical debate was interrupted by a massive explosion that shook the entire building. Through the supply closet window, Eleanor could see that federal agents had arrived to support the local police, bringing heavy equipment and tactical teams capable of matching the clinic's military-grade defenses. Dr. Sterling's expression shifted, from confidence to concern, as he realized that his fortress was under assault by forces with capabilities equal to his own. Elena sensed an opportunity in his momentary distraction. "Your network is finished, Sterling," she said with growing confidence. "Even if you escape today, too many people know about your operations, the international connections, the government, partnerships, the systematic modification techniques. It's all going to be exposed." Dr. Sterling's mask of composure finally cracked, revealing the fanatical determination underneath. "Then we accelerate the final phase immediately. If this facility is compromised, we implement Protocol 7. Elena didn't know what Protocol 7 entailed, but Sarah's horrified expression suggested it was something catastrophic. The battle for the Whitmore Medical Center was about to escalate into something far more dangerous than Elena had ever imagined. As federal agents breached the building's outer defenses and engaged Sterling's security forces in intense combat, Elena realized that her personal war against the trafficking network had evolved into something much larger, a fight for the future of human consciousness itself, with stakes that extended far beyond the fate of individual victims to encompass the survival of human dignity and freedom. The explosion that rocked the Whitmore Medical Center created the distraction Elena needed. As Dr. Sterling stumbled from the blast's impact, Elena grabbed Sarah and dove through the supply closet's shattered doorway into the smoke-filled corridor. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows as the building's systems struggled to maintain functionality under assault. "Protocol 7, Sarah gasped as they ran, her knowledge of the clinic's operations proving crucial. "It's not just an escape plan, It's a scorched earth directive. Sterling will destroy everything rather than let the evidence fall into federal hands. Elena felt her stomach drop. What kind of destruction? Thermite charges throughout the building, designed to incinerate all records and eliminate witnesses, Sarah explained, her medical training allowing her to push through the remaining sedatives. But that's not the worst part. The basement laboratory contains experimental subjects in various stages of modification. Sterling would rather murder them all than risk exposure. Elena realized they weren't just fighting to escape. They were racing to prevent a massacre. The dozens of victims she'd seen in the facility would be burned alive to protect the network's secrets, their deaths disguised as an unfortunate accident during the federal raid. The sound of automatic gunfire echoed through the corridors as Sterling's security forces engaged federal agents on multiple floors. Elena could distinguish between different weapons, recognizing the tactical precision of the defenders versus the systematic approach of law enforcement. This wasn't a typical raid. It was urban warfare between equally matched military units. We need to reach the laboratory, Elena decided. If we can free the victims before Sterling activates his destruction protocol, we might save their lives and preserve the evidence. Sarah nodded despite her obvious exhaustion. The thermite system has a central control panel in Sterling's office on the 4th floor. If we can disable it, the charges won't detonate. Elena weighed their options rapidly. Reaching Sterling's office would require fighting through multiple floors of armed resistance, while accessing the laboratory meant potentially trapping themselves in the basement when the building was destroyed. Neither choice offered good odds of survival. Their decision was made for them when Dr. Vaughn appeared at the end of the corridor, flanked by 2 security operatives and carrying what appeared to be a remote detonation device. Dr. Sterling anticipated. "You might attempt to interfere with Protocol 7, Vaughn announced, her voice carrying over the sounds of battle. "I'm authorized to initiate immediate destruction if necessary." Elena stepped protectively in front of Sarah, recognizing the detonation device from her previous encounters with trafficking facilities. The network had learned to prepare for worst-case scenarios, installing fail-safes that prioritize secrecy over asset preservation. "How many people are you willing to murder to protect your conspiracy?" Eleanor demanded. "Dozens of innocent victims who never chose to be part of your experiments." Dr. Vaughn's expression remained coldly professional. "Acceptable losses in service of a larger mission. The techniques we've developed here will eventually benefit millions of people by eliminating the social conflicts caused by individual consciousness. A few dozen casualties are insignificant compared to that potential." Elena realized she was confronting the same ideological fanaticism that had driven Dr. Sterling, a genuine belief that destroying human identity was beneficial to society. These weren't just criminals motivated by profit. They were true believers in systematic dehumanization. "You're insane," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as the sedatives continued wearing off. "Individual consciousness isn't a flaw to be corrected. It's what makes us human." Dr. Vaughn smiled with patronizing condescension. "Ms. Chen, your own experience demonstrates the fallacy of that position. The psychological conditioning you underwent initially eliminated the traumas and limitations that had prevented you from reaching your full potential. It was your insistence on recovering, your original identity, that created the problems you now face." Elena felt Sarah tense beside her, recognizing the manipulation technique. Dr. Vaughn was attempting to convince Sarah that her conditioning had been beneficial, that her struggle to recover her original personality was somehow misguided. "My trauma wasn't eliminated," Sarah replied with surprising firmness. "It was weaponized against me. You didn't help me heal. You used my pain to break down my resistance to psychological control." The distinction was crucial, and Elena was proud of Sarah's ability to recognize it despite her vulnerable state. The network's techniques weren't therapeutic, they were predatory, exploiting victims' psychological wounds to facilitate their systematic destruction. Dr. Vaughan's facade of professional detachment cracked slightly. Your resistance to proper conditioning has made you unsuitable for most client applications. That's why Dr. Sterling scheduled you for advanced modification to correct the flaws. In your personality framework, Elena understood that Dr. Vaughan was revealing the network's ultimate view of human beings as products to be customized according to client specifications. Sarah's recovery of her original personality hadn't been seen as healing, but as product defects requiring correction. The philosophical confrontation was interrupted by federal agents breaching the floor above them. Elena could hear systematic room-to-room searches as law enforcement fought to secure the building against Sterling's defensive forces. "Time to choose, Dr. Vaughan," Elena said, gambling on the possibility that even fanatics might value their own survival. Detonate the charges and die in the explosion, or surrender and face trial for your crimes. Dr. Vaughan hesitated, clearly torn between her commitment to the network and her personal survival instincts. The moment of uncertainty was all Elena needed. She lunged forward, tackling Dr. Vaughan, while Sarah simultaneously grabbed for the detonation device. The struggle was brief but intense. Dr. Vaughan fought with desperate strength, clearly understanding that capture meant the end of everything she'd worked to achieve. But Eleanor's months of investigating trafficking networks had hardened her both physically and mentally, while Sarah's medical training gave her knowledge of pressure points and restraint techniques. Elena emerged from the fight with possession of the detonation device, while Sarah had managed to subdue Dr. Vaughan using a sleeper hold that left the doctor unconscious but unharmed. The security operatives, seeing their commander defeated, chose discretion over valor and melted away into the building's maze of corridors. "Can you disable this?" Elena asked, examining the detonation device's complex array of switches and indicators. Sarah studied the device carefully. It's designed with multiple fail-safes to prevent accidental disabling, but I remember seeing the activation sequence during my time undercover. If we can reverse it, we might be able to shut down the thermite charges. As Sarah worked to disable the device, Elena maintained watch on the corridor approaches. The sounds of battle were intensifying as federal agents pressed deeper into the building, but she could also hear systematic destruction from Sterling's horses as they attempted to eliminate evidence before retreating. "There," Sarah announced with relief, "the charges are disarmed, but Elena, we still need to reach the laboratory. Even without the thermite, Sterling might have other ways to eliminate the evidence and victims." Elena nodded, understanding that their victory was only partial. The immediate threat of explosive destruction had been neutralized, but the victims remained in danger from more conventional violence. They made their way toward the basement laboratory, moving carefully through corridors filled with smoke and debris from the ongoing battle. The building's elegant medical facade was rapidly crumbling under the assault, revealing the fortress-like construction underneath. As they descended toward the laboratory level, Elena and Sarah encountered other victims attempting to escape the chaos. Some were patients in various stages of modification, their confused expressions and disoriented movements testament to the psychological trauma they'd endured. Others appeared to be staff members, nurses and technicians who had been unaware of the facility's true purpose. "Help us get them to safety," Elena told the legitimate staff members, recognizing that many employees had been deceived about the clinic's activities just as thoroughly as the victims. The evacuation effort was complicated by the victims' psychological conditions. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned that they were terrified of leaving the facility, viewing the outside world as threatening and the clinic as their only source of safety and identity. Elena recognized the syndrome from her work with other trafficking survivors. The systematic destruction of individual identity created psychological dependency that persisted even after physical rescue. These victims would require extensive rehabilitation to recover their capacity for independent thought and decision-making. As they worked to evacuate the basement level, Elena made a disturbing discovery. Hidden behind false walls were additional chambers containing victims who appeared to be in suspended animation, their bodies kept alive by life support systems while their minds underwent extensive modification procedures. "My God," Sarah whispered, examining the sophisticated medical equipment. They're performing consciousness transfer experiments, attempting to completely replace one personality with another while keeping the body alive throughout the process. Elena realized they had uncovered the most advanced form of human modification the network had developed. These weren't just psychological conditioning or surgical intervention. They were attempting to literally transplant artificial personalities into human bodies, creating beings that were biologically human but psychologically artificial. The files associated with these experiments revealed the network's ultimate ambition. They weren't just trafficking individuals, they were developing techniques for mass personality replacement that could theoretically be applied to entire populations. The implications were staggering. Sterling isn't just running a trafficking network, Elena realized. He's developing weapons of mass psychological destruction, techniques that could be used to control entire societies by replacing their population's consciousness with artificial alternatives. Sarah's face was pale as she processed the implications. No wonder government agencies are involved. This technology could be used to create perfect soldiers, compliant workers, or eliminate political dissent entirely. Elena understood that they had uncovered something far more dangerous than trafficking. They had discovered research into systematic mind control that threatened the foundations of human freedom and democracy. Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sterling himself, accompanied by a fresh team of security operatives. Unlike his earlier confrontation, Sterling now appeared desperate and unhinged, his professional composure completely abandoned. "You've destroyed everything," he snarled, gesturing wildly at the evidence Eleanor and Sarah had uncovered. 20 years of research, billions of dollars in development. The future of human evolution, all ruined by your sentimental attachment to primitive individuality. Elena faced Sterling with growing confidence, recognizing that his desperation made him more dangerous, but also more vulnerable. "We've exposed the truth about your network. Even if you escape today, the world will know what you've been doing." Sterling laughed hysterically. "Escape? Ms. Martinez, you still don't understand. This facility was always designed to be expendable. The real research, the crucial data, the operational network, all of that exists elsewhere, protected by resources you can't imagine." Elena felt a chill as she realized Sterling was revealing that the Whitmore Medical Center was just one small part of a much larger conspiracy. Even shutting down this facility would barely impact the network's overall capabilities. "But you have served one useful purpose," Sterling continued, his eyes gleaming with manic intensity. "Your investigation has helped us identify weaknesses in our security protocols and operational procedures. The next generation of facilities will be far more difficult to detect and infiltrate." Elena understood that Sterling was treating their successful investigation as a learning opportunity rather than a defeat. The network's response wouldn't be to abandon their activities, but to improve their methods and security measures. As federal agents finally breached the laboratory level, Elena realized that the battle for the Whitmore Medical Center was ending. But the war against the network was far from over. Sterling and his associates represented just one tentacle of a vast conspiracy that extended into government agencies, international organizations, and corporate entities across the globe. The woman who had once been a helpless mail-order bride facing psychological destruction had evolved into humanity's defender against systematic consciousness control. But as Elena watched Sterling being taken into custody while still laughing about the network's greater ambitions, she understood that her most dangerous battles lay ahead. The fight to preserve human dignity and individual identity had only just begun. 1 year later, Elena Martinez stood before a congressional hearing committee in Washington, D.C., delivering testimony that would reshape federal policy on human trafficking and consciousness manipulation. The evidence she and Sarah had gathered from the Whitmore Medical Center had triggered the largest multi-agency investigation in FBI history. The network we uncovered operates across 17 countries with an estimated annual revenue exceeding $2 billion, Elena testified, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. They're not just trafficking individuals, they're developing industrial-scale techniques for psychological modification that pose a direct threat to human freedom worldwide. Committee Chairman Senator Patricia Blackwell leaned forward intently. Ms. Martinez, you're suggesting that elements within our own government agencies were complicit in these operations. Elena nodded grimly. Dr. Sterling's files documented contracts with defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and corporate entities seeking customized human resources with specific psychological profiles. The applications ranged from creating compliant workforces to developing enhanced interrogation subjects. The revelation sent ripples through the packed hearing room. Media representatives frantically typed notes while government officials exchanged worried glances. Elena had anticipated this reaction. The scope of the conspiracy challenged fundamental assumptions about institutional oversight and democratic accountability. Sarah Chen, seated beside Elena at the witness table, added her perspective as both victim and investigator. The psychological conditioning techniques we documented have been refined over decades through systematic experimentation on unwilling subjects. The network possesses capabilities that exceed anything previously known to exist outside of science fiction. Elena watched the committee members process this information, recognizing the mixture of horror and disbelief that had characterized every official briefing over the past year. The evidence was overwhelming, but its implications were so disturbing that many officials struggled to accept its reality. What became of Dr. Sterling and his associates? Asked Representative Maria Santos, one of the few committee members who had been pushing for aggressive investigation from the beginning. Dr. Sterling died in federal custody 3 months ago, Elena replied, her voice carefully controlled. Officially ruled a suicide, though the circumstances raised questions that remain under investigation. Dr. Vaughan accepted a plea agreement and provided extensive testimony about the network's international operations. Elena didn't mention her private suspicions about Sterling's death. The network's demonstrated ability to infiltrate government agencies made any suicide in federal custody highly suspicious, especially given Sterling's detailed knowledge of ongoing operations worldwide. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with Elena and Sarah providing testimony that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic human trafficking disguised as medical treatment. The committee heard evidence of facilities in 12 states, with international connections extending across 5 continents. But Elena knew that public testimony, however compelling, represented only a fraction of what they'd uncovered. Classified briefings with intelligence agencies had revealed connections to foreign governments, terrorist organizations, and multinational corporations that used modified humans for purposes ranging from industrial espionage to political assassination. After the hearing concluded, Elena met privately with FBI Deputy Director Catherine Walsh, who had overseen the federal investigation from its inception. Walsh's expression was troubled as she reviewed the latest intelligence reports. "We've shut down 43 facilities in the past year," Walsh reported, "rescued over 800 victims and arrested more than 200 operators and clients. But for every facility we close, intelligence suggests 2 more are established elsewhere." Elena had feared this outcome. The network's distributed structure and vast resources made it nearly impossible to eliminate entirely through conventional law enforcement approaches. Like a cancer, cutting out visible tumors didn't necessarily stop the disease from spreading. "What about the international operations?" Eleanor asked. Walsh's expression darkened further. "That's where things get complicated. Several facilities operate under diplomatic immunity or government protection in countries where consciousness modification isn't illegal. We can't touch them through normal legal channels." Eleanor understood the implication. The network's international scope put significant portions of their operation beyond the reach of American law enforcement, requiring diplomatic or covert responses that carried their own risks and complications. "There's something else," Walsh continued reluctantly. "We've identified what appears to be a second-generation network that learned from Sterling's mistakes. They're using more sophisticated security protocols, better legal camouflage, and enhanced modification techniques that leave fewer detectable traces." Elena felt the familiar chill of recognition. The network's adaptive capacity had always been one of its most dangerous characteristics. Each exposure led not to elimination, but to evolution, making subsequent operations more difficult to detect and combat. 6 months later, Elena found herself in Prague, Czech Republic, working with Interpol agents to investigate reports of missing persons connected to a luxury rehabilitation center. The patterns were familiar but refined. Vulnerable individuals recruited through legitimate-seeming advertisements then disappeared into facilities that appeared to provide legitimate medical services. Elena's international investigations had revealed the network's global evolution. In countries with less stringent human rights protections, the operations were more brazen, sometimes operating with explicit government sanction under the guise of social improvement programs. Sarah had remained in the United States, working with federal agencies to develop rehabilitation programs for recovered victims. Her unique perspective as both survivor and medical professional made her invaluable in creating treatment protocols for psychological damage that conventional psychiatry was poorly equipped to address. Their partnership had evolved into something larger, an informal network of investigators, survivors, and law enforcement professionals dedicated to combating consciousness trafficking wherever it emerged. Elena coordinated field investigations, while Sarah provided psychological expertise and victim support services. The Prague facility proved to be their most sophisticated target yet. Unlike Sterling's medical center, this operation was embedded within a legitimate psychiatric hospital, making it nearly impossible to distinguish between authentic patients and trafficking victims without extensive investigation. Elena spent 3 weeks gathering intelligence before attempting infiltration. The facility's security was extensive but subtle, relying more on legal protections and official authorization than physical barriers. Getting inside required creating a convincing cover identity that could withstand background checks extending back decades. What Elena discovered inside the Prague facility exceeded even her worst expectations. The operators had perfected techniques for selective memory modification that allowed them to alter specific aspects of victims' personalities while leaving others intact, subjects could be made to forget their families while retaining professional skills, or programmed with artificial loyalties while maintaining their original intelligence and creativity. The applications were staggering. Elena documented cases of political dissidents who had been modified to become government supporters while retaining their original expertise in fields useful to the state. Business executives had been programmed to betray corporate secrets while believing they were acting from personal conviction. Even family members had been modified to serve as unwitting surveillance assets against their own relatives. Elena realized she was witnessing the emergence of something far more dangerous than trafficking, systematic social control through targeted consciousness modification. The techniques being developed could theoretically be used to reshape entire societies without their knowledge or consent. Her investigation was interrupted when she discovered that her cover identity had been compromised. Elena barely escaped. The facility before security forces could apprehend her, but not before transmitting crucial evidence to Interpol agents waiting outside. The Prague raid that followed revealed the facility's connections to government agencies across Eastern Europe, multinational corporations seeking industrial espionage capabilities, and criminal organizations requiring enhanced human resources for specialized operations. Elena's final report to international law enforcement agencies painted a sobering picture of humanity's future if consciousness trafficking continued to evolve. The technology and techniques were advancing faster than legal frameworks or security measures could adapt, creating opportunities for systematic abuse that threatened the foundations of democratic society. But Elena had also learned something crucial during her years of fighting the network. Individual human consciousness, despite its apparent fragility, possessed a resilience that even the most sophisticated modification techniques couldn't entirely eliminate. Sarah's recovery, the brief moments of awareness she'd seen in other victims, and her own survival all demonstrated that the human spirit could endure and eventually overcome even systematic attempts at its destruction. Elena Martinez had begun her journey as a desperate woman seeking escape from loneliness and poverty. That vulnerability had nearly cost her everything when she encountered Marcus Blackwood's predatory operation in Colorado. But surviving that experience had transformed her into something the network's architects hadn't anticipated, a protector of human dignity who understood their techniques intimately enough to develop effective countermeasures. The mail order bride, who had once been helpless in the face of psychological manipulation, had become humanity's defender against those who would reduce consciousness itself to a commodity. Elena's personal transformation reflected the broader struggle between individual freedom and systematic control that would define the 21st century. Standing in her San Francisco apartment, looking out at the city lights that represented millions of individual human lives, Elena understood that her war against consciousness trafficking would never truly end. The techniques would continue evolving. New networks would emerge, and the fundamental conflict between human dignity and systematic exploitation would persist as long as people valued power over compassion. But Elena also knew that every victim rescued, every facility shut down, and every operator arrested represented a victory for the principle that human consciousness belonged to the individual who possessed it. In a world where technology increasingly enabled unprecedented forms of control and manipulation, that principle was worth defending regardless of the personal cost. The woman who had once answered a mail-order bride advertisement out of desperation had found her true purpose in protecting others from the same fate she had narrowly escaped. Elena Martinez's journey from victim to protector was complete, but her mission to preserve human freedom and dignity would continue for as long as threats to consciousness itself remained active in the world. Some battles were worth fighting, not because victory was guaranteed, but because the alternative, surrendering to those who viewed human beings as programmable commodities, was unthinkable for anyone who still believed in the irreplaceable value of individual human consciousness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.